Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Soul Good Podcast. I am your host, Brittany Rose, and it is such a pleasure to have you here with me today. I am very, very thankful for everyone who has tuned into this podcast and given me the motivation to return here every week. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a life coach, I'm an author, and I'm an advocate for all things healing. And so this platform is a space for the truth about the healing journey where we learn a lot about what it means to heal and how to better ourselves and sharing the realities of what it looks like to do that. And so I would like to give a huge shout out to all the people who have been listening so far. It is always just a pleasure to check every week and just see where our listeners are tuning in from, what cities y'all from, and who's out there really showing us love. All right, you guys. So this week we are up to 20 cities so far with our listeners, and I'm just so excited to continue to see all these different locations pop up on the map, y'all. We got 20 cities across the map that have been tuning into our platform. So I want to give y'all a shout out for listening because I really do appreciate the love and the support. It just makes me wake up every day and want to continue this journey and share my experience and create this space for people like me who enjoy this type of information. So with that being said, y'all ready? Y'all ready to hear who's been listening? Amen. 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 Shout out to Europe. Shout out to Europe. We got a listener in the United Kingdom. Oh man. Oh man. My heart is so full. Okay, so listen. We are continuing to touch the cities over the seas, and that just brings me so much joy. I can't even believe it. All right. So we got Seattle in the building. Shout out to my hometown for holding it down. We have Spanaway, Washington. Thank you for tuning in. We have Fresno, California, Atlanta, Georgia, Frankfurt, Germany. Okay. Shout out to you. Shout out to you for listening all the way in Germany. We got Charlotte, North Carolina, Grand Prairie, Texas, Vancouver, Washington, Kent, Washington, Dallas, Texas, Houston, Texas, Phoenix, Arizona, Twin Falls, Idaho, Wakefield. Where that at? Stop. I don't even know where that's at. It's over in the United Kingdom somewhere. So shout out to you. Like you just do not understand. That just lights my fire. United Kingdom. We locked in. I love you. Thank you for listening. We have Jacksonville, Florida, St. Augustine, Florida, Miami, Florida, Fairfax, Virginia, Auburn, Washington, and Federal Way, Washington. So thank you guys so much. Thank you. Seriously, it is blowing my mind that there are people that are just tuning into this and listening all over. And I'm just so thankful. Seriously, I thank you so much for tuning into this and giving me just such a thrill for this journey. I'm not gonna lie, I'm glad that I just checked that right now and saw who was tuning in because I was feeling really sad kind of about our topic today. I'm not going to lie, it's a little heavy, but it's so important that we talk about things like this. And as I said in my intro episode, not every episode is going to be fun and we ain't going to have gunshots going off, every single week and laughing and kikiing. Sometimes we're going to be really focused on understanding how we even get to the point of needing to heal. And today's episode is going to cover the whole reason for why we are existing in this space, why we're learning these tools, and how we're going to be able to transition, right? And so I've been dragging my feet, y'all, to be honest, just recording this because I don't want to lose people because I know that when things get real, it can be very difficult, right? Which is why I started this platform in the first place. I created this platform because as I've healed from certain things, it has been very difficult for me to feel like I have community, even though I do, live people that are supporting me, that want me to win, that are here for me. I still feel like I don't have a community, right? And so this platform is a space where we can talk about all things healing, good and bad, to understand what it looks like and how we can move forward in those aspects, right? And so I'm not going to drag it out anymore. I'm going to tell you straight up, today's episode, we are talking about trauma. Like, that's what we're going to talk about. And so during this episode, we're going to learn how trauma affects our mental health and how it affects our relationships. We're going to really dive in. This is not going to be a surface level episode or conversation. This is really going to be a deep dive understanding what our triggers are, how they show up, the negative effects they have in our relationships, and how we can control them. Because it's very, very important that we get to a place where we are learning how to control our triggers. The one thing that I say about this journey is it's not linear, right? Like it's all over the place when it comes to healing, when it comes to evolving. You're going to be all over the place. But I can tell you one thing's for certain, that the one thing that remains constant is you will get triggered. It's inevitable because the trauma already exists, right? Like if you didn't have any trauma, then maybe you wouldn't be as triggered, or you wouldn't be in situations where you find yourself being triggered, right? But because the trauma exists, you get triggered. And you're going to continue to get triggered. And what I've learned is that the healing journey is not to ignore the triggers or make them go away. The healing journey is, in fact, to learn how to manage your triggers and make sure that your triggers are not managing you. That is a huge aspect of this healing journey, and it will help you tremendously as you continue to go on your journey, right? Because of the nature of this conversation, I do want to take some time to just preface the conversation. This is a trigger warning for this episode. If you have dealt with trauma in the past, or if you're currently dealing with trauma, I want you to have the choice to participate in this conversation or not, if your trauma is still sensitive to you. And so with that being said, for anyone who's dealt with or currently dealing with trauma, I want you to know that it is always, always recommended, especially by me, that you see and talk to somebody about those things and learn that you do have a safe space to talk about the triggers and your traumas that have affected you in your life, okay? Before we start to talk about like any ways that trauma affects us, any triggers that we have, you know me, I'm old school. I like to slow it down. I like to get to the nitty gritty, and I like to really understand what it is that we're doing here, right? So we're not walking into this blindly. We are going into this knowing exactly what the beast is that we're dealing with and what trauma looks like. And so this is a very informal episode. There's a lot of information that I found and that I want to share with you all about trauma that I just found really fascinating. I'm a lover for this type of information. I eat it up like candy, to be honest with you. So when I find information like statistics or things like that, it helps put things in perspective for me. And so you'll have to excuse me while I nerd out over my stats and my definitions for a little bit this episode. But so when we're dealing with trauma, we just ask ourselves generally, like, what is trauma, right? What is it? How does it even come about, right? So according to Integrated Learning Systems, trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, and diminishes their sense of self and their ability to feel the full range of emotions and experiences. Okay? And so some supporting information that I pulled from the nationalcouncil.org is that 70% of adults in the U.S. have experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their lives. When we put it numerically, that's 223.4 million people. Okay? And so right away, before we even get into any information, I want to let you know that the reason why I included that in this episode and with the definition is so that you fully are aware that if you are experiencing or have dealt with trauma in the past, you are not alone. You are not alone, and you deserve to be seen. And so when it comes to the definition that was provided, I chose this definition for this episode because I appreciated that it spoke to not only what trauma is, but what it does, right? And so trauma is obviously a response to a distressing or disturbing event. What it does is overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, and diminishes their sense of self-worth and their ability to feel their own full range of emotions and experiences. So we're talking about 70% of a population experiences something like trauma. What that lets me know is that according to those statistics, most people have experienced some form of trauma in their lives. As I do this work, as I talk to people, as I do research, as I continue to further my education when it comes to the healing journey and where trauma and things like that come from, even though we're adults trying to analyze and understand trauma and how it affects our lives, it's very important to understand that most of our trauma, original trauma that is, predates to when we were children. And so it was really important for me to understand exactly how trauma affects children, right? This information is furthered from the nationalcouncil.org. I was a little curious as to what are the exact experiences that cause trauma for children that grow into be adults. Trauma in children stems from a variety of different events, included but not limited to neglect, war, accidents and natural disasters, grief and loss, substance abuse, sexual abuse, school shootings, community violence, medical interventions, and cultural and historical trauma. A child does not have to be the direct victim of such an occurrence to be traumatized. Witnessing such an event can also be traumatic. While various types of trauma exist at different degrees of intensity, the individual's stress associated with each trauma affects how he or she responds to and behaves following a traumatic event. And so let's just marinate here for a second, because when we're talking about a population experiencing those types of situations, that means it's way more common than we think, right? That means if it ain't you, it's the other person and half of the other person next to you, right? And so, like, trauma is very common amongst us as a people, and it is something that we don't talk about a lot, right? We don't really have conversations about how we've been affected as kids. I think everybody kind of has these ways that they've tried to brush it off or act like it doesn't exist. We have these facades that we create or ways that we kind of operate or suppress those parts of us. But when I see how many people are affected by trauma, not even only in my own life, but just out in the world, like, it's everywhere, whether it's on the news, whether it's within your own family or even within yourself, it certainly exists on a much broader level than we give it credit for. And so I wanted to pull those statistics so people just have an understanding that you are not alone. Now that we have some information about what trauma is, where it comes from, we're now going to get into how the trauma affects us as children. And so I found an article on the internet from Safe Schools Healthy Student that provided some really good information about how trauma shows up in children, and I wanted to share that with you. So when we ask ourselves the question, how does trauma show up in children, right? Like, that's what I really wanted to know here. The way that trauma affects children differs depending on developmental stage, environmental factors, and social settings. Just as each person experiences and responds to trauma differently, trauma manifests itself in different ways, okay? And so when they're using words like developmental stages, environmental factors, social settings, all of that is very important information to grab onto here, okay? So like developmentally, depending on where you were in your life, whether you were an infant, whether you were a school-age child, whether you were adolescent, whether you're a teenager, that matters. It matters because of the brain and how the brain works, the brain and how the brain develops. For example, if you were traumatized as a child, you may not have the same capabilities of processing things as if you were a teenager or an adolescent, right? And so when your trauma took place is very important, and that pertains to the developmental stage of your life. Environmental factors, that's going to be your community, right? Your direct external influences, your neighborhood, your school, your parents. Those are all very, very important aspects of your trauma as well, because what environments were you in that created that type of trauma in your life? There are some environments that naturally produce environments that are not safe for children. If you're talking about substance abuse, if you're talking about gang violence and activities like that, those are all backgrounds that unfortunately are not safe spaces for children. And so growing up in those types of environments certainly affect you and play a role in the trauma that you experience in your life, right? They go on to further state that when infants and young children are exposed to chronic or acute maltreatment within the caregiving context, brain development may be compromised, and emotional, behavioral, or learning challenges may persist, especially in the absence of targeted and trauma-informed interventions. That elaboration to me is very important because it lets you know about how the brain works. When I started doing this healing journey, there were a lot of things that I was trying to learn from the context of just like emotion wise, right? Like why our emotions operate the way they do. The further I dove deep into this work, the more I understood like, oh, that's secondary, right? Like our emotions are secondary. We all have a human body, and in our bodies is a brain. The brain controls everything that goes on in our bodies. And so certainly there's a reaction going on in your brain well before it's executed out into your body. And so it's important to understand that when the brain development is compromised due to any form of trauma that you've sustained in childhood, while your body is developing, while you are on the outside growing up and becoming an adult, your brain is stuck at a standstill and it doesn't fully develop as it pertains to that trauma, right? Learning this about just trauma in general was such a game changer for me because I could never fully understand why, like, I'm pretty mature, right? Like, I'm a pretty mature adult who can conduct themselves as a 32-year-old woman, but I would find myself in situations where, maybe if I was triggered or having some type of reaction, that I felt myself acting younger than I really am. And it would just blow my mind because I'm like, it just felt like out of character. That's what I would call it. But deep down, what was happening is that I was being triggered and I had no idea that that's what was happening. My brain was responding to something that I didn't even know was existing within my body. So it's very hard to control those things and those impulses because my brain was automatically just doing these things. So the reason why I emphasize on brain development is because it does play a huge, huge part of the healing journey. And matter of fact, science and studies show that as you heal, your brain actually repairs itself. And so I can truly attest to that because I definitely feel my brain doing some repair work as this healing journey takes place. Now that we have a little bit more understanding of what trauma is, I want to get into triggers. When we're talking about ourselves being triggered by past traumas, it's very important to understand what's going on, right? So now we understand what trauma is in general. It really makes me excited to shift into understanding what the triggers are because the triggers are what is not going to stop. The trauma happened when you were a kid, right? But your triggers are actively following you into adulthood and beyond. And so it's so important to understand what these triggers are and how they affect you because the moment you can control them, or not necessarily control them, but the moment you can manage them, you become such a peaceful person and so much more aware of yourself, right? So I have two different definitions of triggers. The reason why I did that is because one's kind of basic, the other's a little bit more of a deep dive, but just ride with me. We're going to do something. All right, so what is a trigger? According to Oxford Languages, they describe it as a small device that releases a spring or catches and so sets off a mechanism, especially in order to fire a gun, right? So to me, that's giving like device, right? Like it's going to set the gun off and make it shoot. So now that we understand what a trigger is pertaining to a gun, let's understand what trauma triggers are. So according to UPMA Healthbeat, they say that experts in PTSD, aka post-traumatic stress disorder, state that anything that reminds you of what happened before or during a trauma counts as a potential trigger. Right. And I love that definition because it's not super complex. What it says is that anything that reminds you of what happened before or during a trauma is a trigger, period. We don't have to like make this complicated. What that means is that there are several opportunities for you to be triggered as it pertains to your trauma. They provided some examples of what some triggers are, and I wanted to share this with you. Some examples of external triggers can be an anniversary date, financial problems, physical illness, a violent movie, being in a crowded place, loud noises, or seeing someone else use substances such as alcohol or drugs. Okay. And so relating to internal triggers, those are things such as stress, anxiety, feeling abandoned, feeling out of control, pain, tension, and sadness. having an understanding of what these triggers are, what can even trigger you in the first place. Like, I'm going to be honest. This is a lot to talk about. It's a lot to understand, and it's a lot to process, but it's really important. It's really important, right? Y'all, please pray for me because it's just very difficult to have these conversations, but I am very intentional about creating this space where we can have these conversations and, help each other out. And so as I was looking at examples of what triggers are, I didn't really identify with a ton of the external triggers, but I definitely identified with some of the internal triggers that they mentioned. The current version of myself is able to identify and understand what my triggers are. But prior to, I think maybe honestly last year, I really didn't have a grasp on exactly what it is that triggered me. It was challenging for me to deal with certain emotions and address certain situations because I was in such a state of hurt due to external factors and experiencing some really hurtful things, all the while having to acknowledge certain things within my healing journey. I experienced trigger after trigger after trigger last year. And it felt so crazy. Honestly, it felt like I had no control, like none. I was just really lost. Really lost. I couldn't understand why my emotions were so intense, but it's because I was triggered and I had no idea, right? All I remember is just feeling these intense emotions, just sadness, just depression, just anxiety. And I didn't know where those things were coming from or why I was feeling that way, right? And so learning that I was triggered helped me so much because I'm one of them people, like, I like to put a name to something. I like to put a identity to whatever it is that I'm dealing with so that I can learn how to address it, like especially if it's something that's controlling me. And at the time, that's literally what it felt like. What I learned was that my biggest trigger that to this day I struggle with is pertaining to my fear of abandonment. Becoming aware of this trigger has made it so that anytime I find myself in a situation where I perceive that I'm being abandoned or dealing with the potential to even be abandoned, right? Because it's all in my brain. I recognize now what my body looks like as it's going into panic mode and survival mode. And so I did a little research because I wanted to understand, like, what is even happening, right? Like in that moment of being triggered, what is even happening? What am I going through? What am I experiencing within my body that is taking over my entire being right now? Because that's literally how it feels. And so, according to Seattle Christian Counseling, they share that people who suffer from abandonment wounds experience extreme emotional sensitivity to anything that triggers rejection. For example, feeling insignificant, criticized, misunderstood, slighted, excluded, or overlooked. They may experience flashbacks that send them into emotional hijacking. And now, for those of you who don't know what emotional hijacking is, a couple episodes back on accountability, I believe, we talked about what that means and what that looks like. And it's basically getting hijacked from your current state of being to a totally different place that you may or may not typically operate from on a day-to-day basis. And I shared my struggles just kind of with that and how that was also a part of my experience of being triggered. It was like not being able to control myself, not being able to control my own emotions. I had to ask myself, like, in what situations do I find myself in where I'm being triggered? Like, I try to really think of my last times that I've been triggered. And for me, that abandonment wound is very large, right? It's a huge wound that I'm learning to nurture. So, particularly my abandonment wound is activated when I find myself in conflict with others. During those times, it's very hard for me to stay present in the moment. I find my body is starting to have some type of reaction, whether I kind of start like sweating a little bit, my heart starts racing, and then I begin to feel like kind of regression happening. Like I might be going back to a smaller version of myself who's really feeling these intense emotions, right? And so because that's activated and taking place in my body, I recognize that if I don't have the awareness right now, I have the ability to lose control. And sometimes as adults, we find ourselves in situations where we're responding as an adult because that's who we are on the outside. But truly what's taking place is that the inner child inside of us, who's throwing a tantrum, who's cussing somebody out, who's afraid of rejection, who's afraid of being insignificant, is lashing out. And what the other person is seeing is you showing up as this adult, having this uncontrollable emotional experience because you're triggered. And so the reason why I wanted to talk about triggers today is because they're not only damaging to us, but they're damaging to our relationships, right? Because if we are feeling out of control, or if we're losing control of ourselves due to triggers, then essentially what we're doing is allowing ourselves to be controlled by somebody who doesn't need to have any control, right? For example, as a 32-year-old woman, if I'm having a conflict with someone and I recognize that the way that I'm showing up is in that of maybe a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 9-year-old, it's important for me to be aware of that. And it's in those moments that I ask myself, like, okay, looking back at that situation, or even just being present in the situation, I don't want a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old running my interactions because I'm 32. And so as an adult, it's very important to be aware of how your inner child and your traumatic experiences from your childhood may be impacting your relationships present day. I think a lot of people, including myself, struggle with identifying and recognizing these triggers because we're adults now. And again, like I said, for those of us who have become superb or excellent at stuffing your trauma, then it's very easy to say that you're not being triggered. So earlier I gave you a definition that explained what a trigger is, right? And for those of you who missed it, or we've been talking too long and you forgot, it's okay, I'm gonna run it back. Oxford Languages describes it as a small device that releases a spring or catches and so sets off a mechanism, especially in order to fire a gun, right? And so the reason why I pulled that definition is because when I think about how traumas affect our relationships, this is the visualization that I get, right? Imagine we're in like a Western film and we're dealing with a conflict and it's beginning to like become a thing. Rock with me. You've seen the movies. They have the people outside and like everybody's just standing around the small town, and then all of a sudden Bojangle comes from around the corner and Sheriff Ramsey comes out and Bojangle's on his horse. Sheriff Ramsey's coming to the center of the walkway. Bojangle gets off his horse and people are sensing this beef, and so they're scattering into the insides because they don't want to be caught in no crossfire should these fellas lead to a shootout. Okay, you with me? You tracking with me? Let's say that you and I are cowboy and sheriff, right? I'm cowboy, you sheriff. You at one end, I'm at the other. We got beef, there's smoke. I don't know exactly what's going on, but we're trying to get to the bottom of it. Now, if we're conducting this transaction as two people with trauma, what's going to happen is that as we get into this conversation, let's say as Bojangles, who's from around the way, and I have a history of acting up, and I might have burned some bridges because of my trauma, and now I might be, the town's most wanted. I'm coming with my hand already on my gun. I'm getting off the horse ready, right? So my hand's already here. Regardless, I know we have a conflict, but because of my trauma and where it sits with me, I got my hand ready. Okay. And so now that I'm coming to this situation with my hand on my gun, now the sheriff is like, well, shit, I have to protect myself. So let me put my hand on my gun and let me make sure if it pop off, I'm protected. Right. And so now you got Bojangle and sheriff with their hands on their guns and they're supposed to solve a conflict. Okay. Let's go for it. Let's try to solve this conflict. So I'm telling Sheriff how last time I came into town, my huckleberry pie was not hot like I wanted it to be at the restaurant, at the tavern like I wanted it to be. And that really just pissed me off, right? Now, Sheriff is starting to take things personal because his trauma, he felt like he was inadequate his whole life. He felt like he never did nothing right. His parents was disrespectful to him. They told him that he would never amount to nothing. So he takes his job as sheriff, as top flight security of the world. And here go Bojangles telling him that he messed up by not having his pie ready and waiting for him when he came into town. So guess what he's starting to do? He's starting to put his hand on the trigger, right? Like on it. Right? We went from having our hand on the gun to now we getting it ready to shoot. Okay? Because Bojangles is coming in hot about his Huckleberry Pie. And I don't want no smoke. I don't want no smoke because I fear that it might just get to that point. Now, do you see how this trauma is going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, where these fellas, Bojangles and the sheriff, are triggering each other because of their own preconceived notions about whatever it is that they've dealt with in their past. Okay? And so I imagine these types of scenarios when we're talking about trauma. I can visibly see when somebody is showing up to a conflict with me and they've got their hand on their gun. I also can actively identify when I am showing up to an interaction with my hand on my gun. Now, I might not always know it in the moment, but certainly after I've done some reflecting at this point, I can understand, oh yeah, I went reaching. Simple. Went reaching. And so there's some relationships that you'll have with people where it's just like tug and pull. And you don't know why. You're like, why is it just hot and cold? Well, it might be a situation where y'all both are triggering each other and you're not able to come to the surface in a healthy way that allows you to be disarmed, right? Because that's the goal. We want to be disarmed. We want to have the boundaries. We want to have the weapons and protection if we need it. But we certainly don't want to show up to situations already ready to discharge the armor. You know what I'm saying? Like, you got to be cool, right? In order to be cool, it implies a lot of other things like security within yourself, which is something that we'll talk about. Boundaries in place that you are okay with so that you don't have to show up armed, hun. You don't, right? That was a really elaborate demonstration. Shout out to Bojangles and the sheriff for the demonstration. But in all seriousness, I hope it helps you understand how triggers affect your relationships, right? And how sometimes it's okay to just go into a situation and give yourself the space to just be there, right? You don't have to allow your triggers to control you. And I know that stuff is really easier said than done. Like, literally from me, the person saying it, it is easier said than done. But also for me, the person who actively does it, I understand that it's fully possible, right? And so the last thing I want to get into is when it comes to triggers, the most important thing to recognize about these triggers that you have from your traumatic experiences is that due to the fact that your traumas may have happened or began in your childhood, it's very important to be able to recognize that some of the things that you're being triggered by are not current events, right? And so I'm really proud of this, y'all, because I actually developed this little acronym myself. Pop my little collar. But so it's an acronym that I developed and I use it for myself anytime I feel myself getting triggered. And so I want to share it with you guys because I think it's pretty helpful. And it's very simplistic. It's not like super complex. It's very simple. And it actually just really helps me to kind of reshift my focus and work through the triggers that I'm experiencing, right? And so the acronym in and of itself is STOP. How simple is that, right? Like, I love it because it's just like so simple. When I find myself being triggered, the first thing I'm saying, stop, right? You may ask yourself, what does stop mean? I'm about to tell you, don't trip. The S in stop is for literally stop. All right. And so the goal here is to stop everything you're doing. Like, literally, if you're having a conversation with somebody, if you're in a moment with yourself, it doesn't matter what's going on outside of you. The goal is to stop and immediately draw your attention to yourself, right? All right, y'all. Next letter, T. All right. T in for stop is for take time. All right. What that means is it's perfectly okay to remove yourself from a situation that is triggering you. Period. There's nothing wrong with that. If at any point in time you find yourself in a situation where you're triggered or you're feeling like you maybe even be triggered, right? Let's say you don't even know, but you need to take some time for yourself. That's what the stop is for. And now we're taking it a step further and saying, hold on, I may need some time to sit with this. And what that looks like is simply just using your words. If you're in an environment where there's other people around, you can say something to the extent of, you know what, I really want to be active in this situation right now, but I need a moment to process how I'm feeling right now. And I would really appreciate it. Give me some time. Period. That's all you guys say. And if the person doesn't respect that, oh, well, this is about you and what you need. Or if you even have a little pushback, you can assure them that, hey, it's not you. It's really a me thing. I need to understand what's going on within myself so that I can show up to this interaction or this situation as my best self. Because that's the goal. We don't want to be emotionally vomiting. We don't want to be doing any of that. We want to show up in a healthy way that allows us to maintain our relationships with others and build stronger connections with people. All right, so the O in stop is for observe. So after you stopped, after you've taken your time, now this is where the magic happens, because I like to pull myself back from the situation like in its entirety, right? What I mean by that is I like to give myself a world view of the situations that I'm in with people by taking a step back and observing the situation from a more broad perspective, right? Like looking at myself and the other person, looking at both my actions and their actions, the situation, the circumstances, all the factors and variables in the situation. The main things that I'm looking for when I'm in observation mode, and I ask myself these things: was the reaction, feelings, or trigger based on current or past events? Okay. Like, was the situation based on current or past events? It's very important to understand that because, again, as we said, when you're being triggered, it's not always pertaining to something that's happening in the moment. Sometimes you're being triggered and these emotions are old, but they're coming back to the surface. So it's very important to understand the root of the feelings, right? And so the other question that I ask myself, okay, is now that I know whether this is current or past, is this accurate or is this false information that's being presented, right? Because sometimes when we're triggered, those lies start to activating, right? Sometimes when we're triggered, our minds will tell us things about ourselves that are not necessarily true. You tell yourself things like you're inadequate, like no one cares about you, that they're going to leave you like everyone else does. Those are all things that keep us ruminating in the fact that this trigger is actively real and present in the moment, when actually that's old narrative that is still being told over and over to yourself in your head. And so it's very important that when you're able to identify that it's past emotions, then you can go into, okay, how do I tell myself something different currently? How do I talk myself off that cliff a little bit, because this is not something that's current and I don't want it to affect the current situation that I'm in, right? So making that distinction is very important between past, present, as well as accurate versus false, okay? And so lastly, the P in stop stands for process. Okay. And when we are talking about processing, triggers bring up a lot of emotions that can vary depending on your trauma, right? It could be sadness, it could be anxiety, feelings of stress, feelings like you're not safe. And so as those emotions come up, it's very important that you're able to process them appropriately. A lot of people, when they're triggered, we don't know how to assess the situation. We don't know where the feelings are coming from. And therefore, those feelings actually never get processed. They just wait for the next time that we're triggered and they come up again. And now you have developed this same response to your trigger rather than understanding the response and being able to maybe choose to respond differently in your triggers, right? And so we don't want to stay in a place of being triggered. The whole goal of processing your triggers is so that you can move on, right? The trauma is not going to go anywhere. We can't take away from the past traumatic events, but what we can do is work on learning to control the way that those events affect us and how we move forward in our lives, having control of our triggers instead of our triggers controlling us, right? And so that brings me to the end of the information that I have for this episode. I hope that this information has been really helpful for you in terms of learning how to take more control of the emotions that you feel, especially when they're attached to old events that have been unresolved. I want to say more than anything, I am a huge advocate for therapy and counseling. And the biggest factor in my healing journey has been therapy, going to sit with someone and talking to someone about my trauma so that they can direct me to the ways that I'm being triggered. Trauma is something that universally we don't like to acknowledge, we don't like to live with, we don't like to sit with. And so when we run from it, it just creates more problems in our lives. And you don't have to admit it, because one thing about trauma is it's going to be what it is, and it's going to look like what it looks like. And so getting in front of it, allowing somebody an opportunity to help you process yours, because like we learned earlier, 70% of the US population has dealt with trauma, right? And so people who are therapists, they literally dedicate their lives to talking to people like you and I, right? Therapists have therapists. It's very important to speak to somebody about your life and the ways that you have been affected by the hurtful experiences that you've dealt with. More than anything, I just want this to serve as encouragement and motivation for anybody who's out there, whether you were thinking about going to therapy, on the fence, you don't know. I'm telling you right now, do it. You will not regret it at all. It is such an investment to your health that the return on that investment is endless. You hear me? Endless. Right? This is abundance. This is wealth. This is breaking generational curses. This is real work that we ought to do so that we can have better lives, so that our children can have better lives, and so that our lineage is attached to wellness instead of the trauma that we were handed down. And so I really hope that this message inspires people to move forward and pursue their own wellness and allow themselves to slowly lift the trauma off their backs, and so that they can see how those experiences made them who they are today in the best ways. All right, so with that being said, we've reached the end of episode 5, y'all. We are halfway through this season, and I'm really feeling good about that. So thank you again for tuning in. I know today's topic was really tough. It's very difficult, but I hope that it gave you some insight. And if you have any questions, or if you even want to just talk to somebody, no, but for real, like if you have any questions or concerns, or if you maybe even just want to get pointed in the right direction of how to start your own healing journey and you need just a little bit of guidance, please reach out to me. I am reachable at all my platforms. You can send me an email at thesoulgoodpodcast@gmail.com. You can slide in my DMs on Instagram at thesoulgoodpodcast. We are a safe space for all folks. And so with that being said, I'm your host, Brittany Rose. We thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Brittany Rose, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Soul Good Podcast. Happy Soul Good Sunday. What's up, everybody? Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Soul Good Podcast. As we talked about trauma today, I couldn't help but feel my own within this space. Being transparent about trauma is very difficult. I wanted to record this episode so we can begin having these types of conversations, even though it may feel a little uncomfortable. On the other side of our discomfort is freedom, a valuable asset that we all deserve to experience. So I thank you again for tuning in. I am your host, Brittany Rose, and I look forward to seeing you next week for another episode of the Soul Good Podcast. Happy Soul Good Sunday.